The Tom Woods Show, episode 450.
Prepare to set fire to the index card of allowable opinion. Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Want to learn a highly marketable skill in your spare time in a way that's rigorous and yet fun and engaging and inexpensive? Then learn web technologies at Code School. Get your free account through tomwoods.com/code. Hey everybody, Tom Woods here. I know how much people enjoy hearing stories about how other people went from whatever views they used to hold to today, where they, of course, agree with us. A lot of people find these interesting. I find them interesting. And we've got a really interesting one for you today because I think it's a highly unusual route to libertarianism via Noam Chomsky, of all people. Joining us to share his story today, and I hope this is the beginning of a long and friendly relationship on the show, is Gene Epstein, our old friend Gene Epstein. Well, he's my old friend. I don't know about you guys, but Gene Epstein is economics editor and book review editor for Barron's, perhaps the nation's premier financial periodical. He is the author of Econospinning, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulate the Numbers. And Gene joins us from Manhattan today to talk about this story of his, which I'm sure you'll find interesting because it involves Noam Chomsky, Murray Rothbard, the Vietnam War, and so much more. Gene, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here, Tom, and an honor to be on a show that does as well as yours at being a place for libertarians to discuss important ideas.
Well, I appreciate that, and I am going to let you make your announcement since it involves me. So,
yes,
so go ahead.
Indeed, it does. Among the different things that I do, aside from being economics editor at Barron's and book review editor, I run a monthly meeting in Midtown Manhattan in an auditorium that seats about 200 people. And I've been running Oxford-style debates recently in that venue. And I'm going to be moderating a debate on December 3rd. That's Thursday evening, December 3rd. And it's going to feature Tom Woods squaring off with Michael Malice on the following resolution having to do with Alexander Hamilton, that Alexander Hamilton was a hero for the cause of liberty. Tom Woods is going to take the negative. Michael Malice will take the affirmative. And it's going to be Oxford style in the sense that the audience is going to vote initially for, against, or undecided on the resolution. And then after the debate is over, the audience will be polled once again, and the winner of the Tootsie Roll will be the debater who moves the needle in his favor. So it's going to be an honest debate, and I recommend to your listeners who are out-of-towners, if you're planning to visit Manhattan, do so around Thursday, December 3rd. We're in Midtown Manhattan at 20 West 44th Street, right in the touristy section of town. So you don't want to miss Tom Wolfe on December 3rd, Thursday evening in Manhattan.
All right. So, well, Tom Woods, right? It'd be nice if Tom Wolfe would come.
Did I say Tom Wolfe?
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. That'd be nice, though. Let me point out for people are still going through my back catalog of episodes. So just so they know, it's 2015. So if you're listening to this in 2016, you missed it. But I might have done it as a podcast episode that you'll catch up to someday. So I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
And you will know by 2016 whether Tom won or lost that debate against Mr. Malice.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I'm telling you, I'm going to have to hang my head in shame if I have to come on this show and say I lost the debate. I'll cop some excuse, though. I'm pretty good at coming up with a good excuse.
Right. Maybe I'll help you out, Tom, on the excuse.
I appreciate that. Let's turn to you now. When I was in Manhattan with my wife and a couple of our kids last week, I stopped by to see you, and I thought that maybe we'd chat for about an hour. We talked nonstop for 3 hours and would have kept on going if I hadn't remembered that I do, in fact, have a family that I need to get back to. But one thing that I found interesting was when you told me that in your own path to libertarianism, Noam Chomsky played a substantial role.
Yes.
Well, that got my attention. So I decided that I know people love these stories. People love hearing about the different ways people got to where they are now. And I thought before we have episodes where we talk about strictly economic topics, which is your specialty, let's talk about your personal story. Tell me about Noam Chomsky.
Sure. I do agree with you, Tom, that when we think about how we ourselves evolved to be libertarians, that it helps us sort of understand how to win converts. And I think it's partly been my special mission to talk to people on the left. A talk that I deliver, in fact, I delivered it in Bucharest and elsewhere as well, is called Bleeding Heart Capitalism. I am a bleeding heart, and of course, for that reason, I'm a capitalist, and try to convince progressives that they too should be capitalists if they're bleeding hearts, if they care about poor people. And so that's my background, and Chomsky was a very, very important way station on my path to libertarianism. Chomsky, I'm gonna just summarize him briefly and then sort of start the story from the beginning. But Chomsky, still to this day, will call himself a libertarian socialist. We all know that that's an oxymoron, that it's impossible to be both a libertarian and a socialist, and that is, in fact, of course, his great intellectual blind spot, enormous blind spot, that he does not understand that a libertarianism requires capitalism. But he still is on the libertarian side. I think he did unusual work. But in my case, I should say that sort of act one in my story is that in my single-digit years, I mainly advocated my mother's position on the holiness of the Soviet Union, since she was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. My parents split up when I was 7. My father was actually a rich capitalist, although an FDR liberal, and that didn't give me a whole lot of guideposts. But then, by the time I became a teenager, get this, in my sort of pathetic intellectual development, I rebelled naturally against my mother's pro-Soviet views, and I became a democratic socialist. I read Michael Harrington's The Other America. That was this notorious book about poverty in America, which of course argued that poverty in America would never go away unless the government got directly involved. And then through Michael Harrington, I started reading the Democratic Socialists of the Dissent crowd. That was people like Irving Howe, for example. Dissent is actually still going in another incarnation, even though those guys are dead. And so that's where I was actually in my early 20s. I thought, well, this has got sort of splits the difference. You don't have to be pro-Soviet. You have to understand it's a pretty vicious, easily understand that's a pretty vicious regime, just as Michael Harrington and Irving Howe did. But you're socialist nonetheless because you care about the poor, and of course you don't have a clue about what capitalism is all about. And indeed, I did not. I hadn't even, by the way, studied economics in undergraduate school, although I've come to believe that was probably, on balance, an advantage, because I would have been brainwashed by Samuelson anyway, which wouldn't have helped my intellectual development. But now, cut to the Vietnam War is raging, and I attend teach-ins. Obviously, I'm also vulnerable to the draft, and I attend a talk by Noam Chomsky, and I read his book, American Power and the New Mandarins, and I started to write him. I began to exchange letters with him. That didn't make me unusual. As many know, Chomsky had this enormous correspondence. He wrote back to everyone, and I was sort of blown away by his point in American Power and the New Mandarins that the professors, the think tank intellectuals, whom I identified with strongly as a would-be socialist and as someone who was beginning to get interested in studying economics, that these people could no more be trusted than the old mandarins could be. And when Chomsky wrote a particular point of contrast between the old mandarins and the new, that really shocked me. He said specifically that Averell Harriman is a sort of capitalist aristocrat who thinks he has a right to run the world because his grandparents owned railroads. And Walt Rostow, that was the person Chomsky singled out, who was a professor, an academic intellectual, foreign policy wonk, thinks he has a right to run the world because he's smart. And Chomsky surprised me for a socialist by saying that on balance, if I had to choose between these two evils, I would prefer Averell Harriman. And he said, why? Because if Averell Harriman is wrong, his grandfather still owned railroads. He's not going to be insecure and defensive. He'll be open to change. But if Walt Rostow is wrong, then maybe he's not so smart. Then Walt Rostow will probably get more and more defensive and more difficult about his position. And so the whole idea that I should trust capitalist aristocrats over the new Mandarin intellectuals, that sort of stunned me. And it gave me, it sort of liberated me intellectually to understand that the experts are not always right. And that we all have to think for ourselves, and we all have to recognize that none of these people have a right to run the world. And so that was really the conditioning I got from Chomsky, which I know made an enormous difference to me, because then we get to Act 4 in my story. I was studying economics at the New School under Robert Heilbronner, and in fact, Heilbronner, many of your listeners may be too young to know who he was, but he was a sort of best-selling economist in the world. His book, Worldly Philosophers, I actually helped co-write his textbook. He made a fortune from his books, and he was a socialist-leaning thinker. When I was at the New School, and I was sort of going and moving in that direction in economics, and but then I was in a funk. I found that there was nothing in the sort of left-leaning economics that I was learning at the New School, nothing in Karl Marx, nothing really in the mainstream for me, and I was going to drop out. In fact, I was teaching economics in college, getting bored by the subject. I hadn't completed my PhD. And then, by happenstance, I picked up Rothbard's book, Man, Economy, and State, which was in the library at the New School. And that book was my ticket in. Again, the conditioning I had to recognize that the mainstream can often be wrong and that they are not necessarily on the side of morality and good. That conditioning I got from Chomsky, I think, made me unusually open to Rothbard and his arguments. And I for that book was I had so many eureka moments reading that book that very quickly I became converted. Specifically, by the way, because in that book, Man, Economy, and State, Rothbard does have a lot of sections and digressions in which he not only constructs the Austrian concepts, but where he specifically addresses the mainstream fallacies that I had partially imbibed. I had some dissatisfaction with him, but that's when Rothbard sort of blasted me away. And then luckily, at that time, the Laissez-Faire Bookshop was a bricks and mortar bookshop in downtown Manhattan. I lived on the Upper West Side. I used to bicycle downtown every Saturday to pick up a couple of books at the Laissez-Faire Bookshop. And I was an omnivorous reader of Rothbard, Hayek, Kerzner, the whole range of Austrian economists, and they basically converted me. And my ticket in was through economics via Chomsky, and then once I appreciated the economics, my predisposition to libertarianism was enough so that I developed all the way. And also, of course, I read Human Action. I read most other publications by Mises, and I became a fully converted Austrian libertarian by the time I was about 30 years old.
Gene, tell me exactly what the time frame is we're talking about. What are the years in which you're doing this reading?
Well, I'm 70 years old, so let's see. This must have been, let's see, so if I'm dating this, I was 30 in 1974. This is the late 1960s, early 1970s, and when all this happened. As a matter of fact, I attended. There was a seminar that Israel Kirzner was running at NYU, and I used to. I had a job as a senior economist for the New York Stock Exchange at the time, and I used to cut out from work and go to this afternoon seminar. I actually once barged in, and I say barged in because it was kind of stupid. I barged into a Murray Rothbard class at Brooklyn Polytechnic Institute, and I realized he gave me a fisheye when I raised my hand because I hadn't even thought to ask him if I could sit down and audit the class. So I asked him a brief question. And matter of fact, a number of years later, I guess must have been in 1994, and I know Rothbard died around then. When Rothbard was in Las Vegas, at University of Las Vegas, I called him up because Gary Becker had won the Nobel Prize, and I asked Rothbard what he thought of Gary Becker's winning the Nobel Prize, and Rothbard began by saying something nice. Well, nice that a free market oriented economist is getting recognized, and then I sort of cut in and I asked, "What do you think of Becker's view that a family is like a firm?" And Rothbard said, "I think it's nuts." He hit that great nasal voice of his, and that was more or less what I thought. I thought that I think I mentioned to Rothbard, it's probably more fun to think of a firm as being like a family as well. You could go in the other direction with that the bosses are like the dads and the employees are like the brothers and sisters. But to mathematize it and turn a family into a firm was a little bit off the deep end for an Austrian, just as I myself thought. So that was my only brief encounters with Rothbard personally, but of course I really knew him through his work, and I got a chance from the Mises Institute, by the way, to do an introduction to a huge collection of Rothbard's essays called Economic Controversies. That's, I think, still in print. And in my introduction, I begin by saying, that Rothbard changed my life, as indeed he did. But I think that I don't know if my way in, of course, obviously my way in is idiosyncratic to me, especially since I came from the left and had hugely influenced, of course, by these issues when I was a kid. That imagine your parents split up and your father's a capitalist, your mother's a socialist, and I perceived the world in that way. The Yankees were the capitalist team because they always win. They didn't have any blacks on the team. The National League, the underdog, was the Socialist League. All kinds of confusions in my mind, even when I was a kid, about these issues. So they've been an obsession for me ever since. But I'm happily, of course, arrived now for many years as an Austrian libertarian economist, and luckily, and also by a fluke, got a job at Barron's and was made the first economics editor, partly because those who made me an economics editor, the economics editor, didn't quite realize I was an Austrian libertarian. And now that I've sort of come out of the closet, I'm also the book review editor. I get to publish. I published 3 book reviews by Bob Murphy, who of course is a friend of mine and as well as a regular on your show. So I've been lucky. My career has been meandering, but luckily earn a decent living writing for Barron's and get to do a lot with Austrians and with libertarians and get to publish many of them.
Gene, let's pause for just a moment for this message. Folks, it's a tough economy out there, but at the same time, there's never been an easier time to acquire marketable skills. You've got the internet. And case in point is a place called Code School, which you can visit through tomwoods.com/code. I'm intrigued by it. I've actually checked it out myself. You can become a web developer. You can become a better web developer than you already are. You can design apps. You can be involved in web design. The sky's the limit, and you can learn it cheaply, at your convenience, and in a way that's actually enjoyable. As a matter of fact, a listener of this show wrote into me and said, "I think it's awesome you're promoting self-taught web development stuff on your show. That's the field I'm in, and it's amazing to me how scarce the talent is. I've seen motivated friends of mine change career paths, self-teach, and land great jobs within 6 months' time. Definitely a great career. Get your free account through tomwoods.com/code. Gene, I had a feeling that was the time frame we were talking about, 60s and 70s.
Yes,
And the reason I asked is that that it's not like Rothbard ever had mainstream recognition or anything. I mean, he did get some mainstream acknowledgement of some of his work, but he was languishing in obscurity academically. But even having said that, the late 60s and early 70s would have been really the nadir of everything, would have been the real wilderness for Rothbard because of the Vietnam War. And you could fit into a telephone booth a number of people who were pro-free market and openly and outspokenly opposed to the Vietnam War. So you must have been part of that too. You must have been one of these people who was hard to classify and hard to categorize, like Ron Paul today. Nobody knew what to do with him because he didn't fit into any category, but at least you had the internet and you could find millions of people who agreed with him. You couldn't do that in those days. What was that like?
Yeah, well, actually, it was a lot of fun, Tom. Truthfully, because of course, it was not a lot of fun to be supporting Chomsky's critique of American foreign policy, but then to sort of wince at his remarks about economics. But with many of my friends and colleagues, it was sort of fun being so, in their view, unclassifiable. And I even have a left-wing friend who's a historian who regards me as, he said, you must be some kind of genius that on the one hand you can object to American foreign policy, and the other, he said, you can be so left-wing at the same time that you're so right-wing, and that sort of thing. When in fact, of course, it's really part of the whole thing to be both. But of course, I could participate in demonstrations and support. There's lots of their fellow travelers. If they want to if they want to object to an American war, then I'll march with them. Why not? And so it didn't really feel isolating. I can understand, of course, Rothbard's situation because he was operating on a much larger stage. But for me, interestingly for me, it was sort of the odd fact that I was interested in fairly narrowly defined economic issues like this crazy idea of monopolistic competition or these other concepts by the mainstream, and I was sort of at sea. But the lifeline for me was man, economy, and state, which lent such clarity to things that were specifically on my mind and made me realize that there really could be such a thing as economics. Indeed, made me realize that the term Austrian economist is kind of a redundancy, that really when anybody naturally thinks about economic issues, they use Austrian methods. I mean, that's a point I know that a similar point was made by Bob Murphy, I think, on your show just a week or two ago when he was talking about his book about Mises's Human Action. In fact, I think that the mainstream is basically crippled by two problems: that they want to pretend that economics is a branch of physics, that everything can be mathematized, and they are crippled by their lust for power, the lust for power on the part of so many of them, a la John Maynard Keynes. They're looking over their shoulders because they all want to be appointed the head of the Federal Reserve, or they want to be chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. So opportunism and math sort of undoes them, and yet I will say that if they're asked to write an op-ed or some sort of popular piece, sometimes, and not in fact surprisingly, they can be insightful, at least if they have some appreciation for markets. They can be insightful because they cast all that aside and they argue like Austrians. Same thing with Milton Friedman, by the way. He's a classic example of somebody who wrote this ridiculous paper on method in economics. Probably, I'm sure you're familiar with it. This crazy idea that all theory is tested by prediction, and that if the prediction works out, it doesn't matter how you put the theory, as long as the prediction works out. And indeed, he even specifically said that if you're analyzing people playing billiards, it doesn't matter that if you don't understand the rules of the game, if you can have a mathematical model that can predict how the balls will move, then that's a good theory. But the odd part of it is that even though the essay had so much critical commentary, Friedman never defended his essay. And in addition, if you ever read any of Friedman's pretty good books, Free to Choose, Capitalism and Freedom. By and large, he's sounding like an Austrian, because you can't help sounding like an Austrian when you're sitting down with people and you try to reason about economics. So in that sense, Austrian economics is irrepressible, and among when people like Friedman sit down and try to be sensible about the world, as indeed he frequently was able to do.
You know, I've already gotten 2 ideas for other episodes just in this conversation so far. So I got to talk to you a lot more often, because I'm very fruitful when we're talking.
Oh, sure. Oh, no, I've got some other ideas. Tom, you ought to do, you really have to do a systematic discussion, for example, of Adam Smith. You should probably do it with George Reisman. Why Adam Smith, as Reisman put it, was both one of the greatest economists as well as one of the worst.
Well, there's definitely Adam Smith's a possibility, but yeah. I want to do an episode on monopolistic competition. Most listeners will not be familiar with that term, and when you hear what they are claiming, you just won't believe how preposterous it is. So I'm going to do that.
Come on, Tom. I got to get it. I got to just mention my answer.
Yeah.
You read Samuelson, and he's talking about literally a barber shop is an example of monopolistic competition, and this is all because of the way you draw the graphs. The monopolistic competition regime is a problem because they're always operating with excess capacity. So get this line, I can quote it from memory. Samuelson said, "The barber shop's chairs are empty much of the time." The barbershop. So I reasoned that probably Samuelson took his haircuts during the week because he had a very flexible academician schedule, and he never noticed that on Saturday, at least when I was a kid, I don't know how it exists today. On Saturdays, the people are waiting in line for a haircut. So the barber had the classic problem of peak versus trough demand, and he had to strike a balance. If he didn't have enough chairs, he would not be able to take advantage of all that business on Saturday. So that's what flummoxed Samuelson. That's just as ridiculous as it gets. And this
and of course, it's obviously true for restaurants. You go into Denny's at 3 p.m, there's nobody there. Sure. But on a Sunday morning, it's packed.
Yes, and Denny's, of course, and Joe's barbershop and Denny's, they are monopolistic to competitors, because they're competitors because they're barbershops, or Denny's is competitor because it's a restaurant, but it's monopolistic because it's got a brand name, Denny's or Joe's Barbershop. So it was that ridiculous. But then the thing that I really loved is that Rothbard shows that the only reason why they decided that monopolistic competitors, as they like to call them, were operating with excess capacity was a trick of geometry. It's the way they had to draw their curves. And Rothbard found a couple of ways to draw it so they no longer had excess capacity. So he solved their geometrical problem. It's one of the funniest examples of the foolishness of the mainstream, and indeed of people who are supposedly as brilliant as Paul Samuelson was supposed to be. It's really an hilarious story.
Yeah, so I'm definitely going to do an episode on that topic, and I'm going to do an episode on, I don't want to give it away, but you mentioned a left-wing publication, Dissent.
Oh, yeah.
Don't give away, you're going to know what I'm referring to. Don't tell the listeners. I want them to be surprised. But do you remember the article, the expose that Gene Genovese wrote in 1994 for that journal, and it was called The Question? Does that ring a bell to you?
I may not have read it.
Good. Okay, well, then I'll tell you when we get off the air, and then I'll tell the listeners. I'm going to actually go through that article.
I did notice you mentioned Gene Genovese in your book, in The Politically Correct Guide to American History. I don't know if that's a clue, but go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, well, yes, exactly. That is it. What I'm referring to there is exactly what I'm going to talk to people about. It's such a great article. But let me ask you before we wrap up. Sure. Sometimes I get the impression, listening to Ron Paul and Murray Rothbard, that they looked at one major question very differently, and that is when we look at state employees or when we look at elected officials more specifically, Ron would often say that these were people, in his experience, that he genuinely believed had good intentions and they just lacked knowledge.
Wow.
That was not Rothbard's view.
Wow.
So where do you come down on that? Is this good intentions gone wrong, or what?
Well, look, both of these guys are my heroes. That includes Ron Paul, who, of course, I did have the pleasure of meeting a couple of times. I'm amazed. I mean, the public, obviously the public choice school and Bastiat and all the rest of them would, of course, be on Rothbard's side. Clearly, politicians have good intentions, and they're not moved by the three great drugs that society offers. Sex, money, and power. Of course they are. Of course, the vast majority of them are corrupted by the lust of sex, money, and power. And the way they pursue these things, of course, is by becoming politicians. I'm astonished that Ron Paul, as brilliant as he is says such nice things about his colleagues. I guess he would tell us he knew all these people firsthand. Is that right? He hung out with all these congressmen, and they were all basically terrific people who were just confused. It reminds me a little bit about what we used to be said about Friedrich Hayek, that he could never attribute dishonesty or venality to his intellectual antagonists. That he was always assuming that they meant well, but they were just a bit confused. I think it's one of Ron Paul's blind spots, I would say.
Gene, if people want to follow your work, of course, I will link to today's show notes page is tomwoods.com/450, and I'm going to link to the books you mentioned. You mentioned Economic Controversies, you mentioned Man, Economy, and State. I'll refer to those, but if you have an archive of columns, I'll link to it there. Would that be the easiest way for people to follow you?
Yeah, I probably don't. I know that most of my columns, I did a couple of ones that in fact, I'd love to discuss with you on a future show having to do with unemployment numbers and with the labor force participation rate.
Yeah, we definitely have to talk about that.
I believe, it's funny that because I get it all as a freebie and I've never collected my columns. I believe that on any Google website, if you put my name in, you'll get most of my columns, and many of them are of interest to libertarians. The book, I do edit a book review section that appears in the first issue of each month in Barron's, and I've had a number of free market people publish. As I say, I published 3 book reviews by Thomas Murphy. I bet most I can say is that if you put, did I say Thomas? Bob Murphy, God, Robert Murphy. If you put Robert Murphy,
well, we seem like the same person sometimes.
Yes, if you put Robert Murphy and Barron's into Google, I believe you'll come up with the 3 reviews he did. He actually did. He did a favorable review of Peter Schiff's book, as well as a favorable of Stockman's. I noticed one of them was negative, and I forget which one that is that Bob did for me. But I believe that's the way. I'm sort of tethered by Barron's. They really like to charge money, at least for whatever has been issued over the last week for anything I write, and so that's a problem. But I believe that if you put my name in, or as I say, Murphy or others, then I think you and with Barron's you can get access. But thanks very much for that effort. But in any case, you can certainly look at Economic Controversy, and I think that gives people a real orientation. I do think that probably the best way in for most is to read, for many at least, is to read Rothbard's essays. Man, Economy, and State was special to me because I was teaching economics at the time, and it really did speak to me in that sense, because I was so focused on those issues like monopolistic competition. But probably if you just read Rothbard's essays, read his methodology, I think a lot of people can find their way in through those essays.
Well, very good, Gene. I appreciate the time, and looking forward to the next time we're on, because I read your column that you sent me, and we have definitely got to discuss that thing. So thanks again.
That'd be great. Thanks a lot, Tom.
All right, everybody, a few things before we wrap up. Of course, tomwoods.com/450 is today's show notes page. But also, I've been getting some inquiries from people about podcasting. They want to know not so much about libertarianism, but about podcasting. I have people who are maybe just about ready to take the plunge, but they want to know, what kind of equipment do I use, and what kind of editing software do I use? How do they get started? So I am thinking of preparing a little page explaining what I do, and then I would link you to people who have full-blown tutorials and stuff like that who can really take you the whole way, but I can at least get you started with the absolute basics. So I am working on that, and if that's of interest to you, I'm going to be shooting some resources out to the people on my mailing list on the subject of podcasting over the next few weeks. So if you're not getting the Tom Woods letter, but you happen to be interested in podcasting in particular, that's going to be one of the things they're going to be getting in the coming weeks. So you can subscribe to that letter by texting the word Liberty to 33444. That will also get you 2 free ebooks. My 14 Hard Questions for Libertarians Answered will come to you, and also my book on how to start your own blog or website, which you can get at freewebsitebook.com, but you also get it when you sign up for my newsletter. So check that out. I'm going to be doing that stuff for you guys. I'm going to have a free podcast course linked there. So I will tell you about it on the show, but in case you missed that episode, sign up for the newsletter and you will be notified about that. Speaking of that website book, of course, remember my standing offer that if you haven't yet started that blog or website, head over to tomwoods.com/publicity, and you'll see how you can get free publicity for it from me once it's up and running. You got to get your hosting through one of my affiliate links over there at tomwoods.com/publicity. You'll also find a video showing you how to go from no blog at all to having a wonderful blog in just about 5 lousy minutes. You've been meaning to do it. That voice in your head is telling you to do it. Now's the time to do it. So check that out at tomwoods.com/publicity. Tomorrow, I'm going to do, I think, an episode on my own. I'm going to do the episode that I hinted at here in the show. I'm just going to go through a fantastic, absolutely shocking article from 1994. I'm not going to tell you what it's about, but it's so great, your jaw is just going to be on the floor the whole episode. So if you haven't subscribed to the show on iTunes or Stitcher, and there's a possibility that this episode could pass you by, I'm telling you, it's going to haunt you the rest of your life. So make sure you do subscribe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Become a smarter libertarian in just 30 minutes a day. Visit tomwoods.com to subscribe to the show for free, and we'll see you next time.